let me try to come to the gist of what I would like to convey as a message. A few years ago, I wrote a book which was called The Geopolitics of Emotion, how cultures of fear, humiliation, and hope are reshaping the world. And in that book, I was attempting to map the emotions of the world, to do a mapping of the emotion of the world. You have maps, physical maps. There are mountains, there are the sea, the land. You have political maps. Here is France, here is Germany. But can you do a mapping of the emotions of the world? And I tried to do that, and I came to the conclusion that there were three emotions that really mattered most when it came to geopolitics, which all of them had a link with the concept of confidence. And in the West, I saw fear on both sides of the Atlantic. In Asia, I saw hope. And in the Middle East, I saw humiliation. And if I look today at those emotions, they still exist, but it's more difficult to say, as I wrote at that time, that there is something like a dominating color, clearly making sense. In the West, for example, you had the two most extraordinary elections, totally unpredicted, both in the United States and in France. And in the United States, we saw the triumph of fear with the victory of Donald Trump. And in France, we saw the triumph of hope with Emmanuel Macron. And I've been traveling the world before those two elections. Nobody seriously thought that this would be the results. On the eve of the American elections, the New York Times published predictions saying that there was between 75 and 92% chances that Hillary Clinton would be the next president of the United States. And outside of France, up till very late, no one knew who Emmanuel Macron was. In the Financial Times of February of this year, I wrote in my conclusion that France could surprise the world and become a beacon of hope in an ocean of Anglo-Saxon despair. And the British, after Brexit, and the Americans, after Trump, thought that Marine Le Pen, the National Front, would come to power. It was only logical that after those two results, this one should come about. And so my first remark is that fear is not what it used to be in the West. It's more complex than that. You see two conflicting trends, and you don't know which one will win. Is it going to be the trend of Macron, or is it going to be the trend of Trump? Trump being in Europe, represented by Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, the Five Stars movement in Italy, whatever. In Asia, there's still hope. But there is also the appearance of fear, the surge of fear. Fear of war, linked to the absolute madness of the North Korean regime, and the fact that you have in power in Washington and in Pyongyang two highly unpredictable powers. I tend to characterize Donald Trump with three I. The first I is for, well, it's true, in English it's not I, it's you. Unpredictability. In French it's imprévisibilité. Sorry. But the two other I's, incompetence and ignorance. And they are playing with nuclear weapons. And you see in the United States a surge of voice in the US Senate to say, well, maybe the president should not be allowed to press the button without control of the rest. There is a naval battle in the South China Sea between the Chinese and the Japanese. They are in control up till something happens. War by accident, we know it as Europeans in 1914, does happen. And there is something in Asia which goes beyond, and that is the rise of religious nationalism. We always speak of Islam as the land of fundamentalism. But you see in Buddhism, in a country like Myanmar in particular, the surge of deeply nationalistic Buddhism. And you see in India, behind Prime Minister Modi, the surge of quite fundamentalist Hinduism, to the point that they want, so to speak, to erase the Taj Mahal from their public image, because the Taj Mahal was built in the 17th century by the Mughal Empire. They were Muslims. And in the Middle East, after the failure of the Arab Springs, with an S, you see a continuation of humiliation. We will never make it. You see a rise of fear of a direct war between Saudi and Iranian, which could start by a war by proxy in Lebanon, which was the reason why I couldn't come yesterday, because my country is involved in this crisis. And at the same time, you see in the Gulf countries in Qatar, but in particular in Saudi Arabia, a will to modernize at great speed the country, using the fight against corruption to control, to centralize power behind the new prince, Mohammed bin Salman. But at the same time, they really want to modernize their country. And the people that came to power are even younger than Macron is in France. So it's a sign of strength, and it's a sign of uncertainty, both. At 32, you don't have the experience necessary to lead through very complex events. And so, what do we see? We see an acceleration of history in front of our eyes, and what I would call a complexification of the issues. And my job has been, for the last 46 years, since I started teaching, to distinguish between what I would call the trend and the trendy. The trend is the fundamental evolution, which really makes a difference in the long run, which people may not be discussing, but that is very fundamentally important. And the trendy is what everybody would discuss, but by the end of the day proves to be more superficial and not real. And in order to make sense of the complexity of the world and to look at the trend behind the trendy, I think you have to put together 5 key evolutions which interact with each other and that are creating the world we live in today. The first trend, by far the most important one, is the equivalent of a tectonic shift in geopolitical terms. And that is the end of the domination of the West on the entire world. For the first time, maybe since what we call the Renaissance, and clearly since the end of the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th century, the West is challenged, seriously challenged, has lost the monopoly for models, which the European West had till the end of World War I, and the American had till the beginning of this century. And we are, so to speak, in between two international systems. America is no longer what it used to be, and China is not yet ready to take the relay. Though the Chinese are coming closer under Xi Jinping to have the ambition to play that role. What is very interesting is that you have two opposing mottos in the mouth of Donald Trump on the one hand and Xi Jinping on the other. Donald Trump says, America first. which is in deep contradiction with the strategic role America used to play for the world. And Xi Jinping says, China number one, which is very different. He says, I want China to return to be what China was up till the end of the 18th century, before China went into a deep decline, starting in 1815, ending around the coming to power of Deng Xiaoping in 1978. And this is the deep trend. I can give you statistics about demography, about the economy, but for the sake of time, I will not do so. Believe me, it's there. And you see in China, around the centralization of power taking place behind what I can only call the last emperor of China, Xi Jinping, the previous one being Mao Zedong. And in between you had a period of collective power. Now this is individual power. And it has negative dimension, it has positive dimension, it's both. There is an ambition in China which you can see, for example, in the world of architecture. I strongly recommend you to go to internet and to play Tianjin Library. It's really a masterpiece of world architecture. It's done by the team of Dutch architects. It's a huge, giant eye, and it's a library. And it's paradoxical, because it comes from a regime that seems to be scared about writers, but love books. And at some point, some kind of reconciliation between those two dimensions will have to take place. But we are in a period of transition. The gendarme, the referee, the champion of democracy that the United States was, is no longer playing that role under Donald Trump. And China doesn't have the universalism which the Americans or the Europeans had before them. The Chinese are ambitious for their country, but they express that ambition in civilizational terms, not in strictly national terms. They say to the world and to themselves, we are going to be back as number one, because the Chinese civilization is the oldest one, and so to speak, the most civilized one. And of course this comes as a result of the humiliation submitted by the Chinese in the late 19th century, when we in the West invaded China, sacked the Summer Palace, took everything we could in terms of masterpiece of art or whatever. They don't want to see that again, and they're back with a vengeance. I mean, in a way, if you want to understand it, in the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 2005, there was a major exhibit called The Three Emperors. And a key piece of that exhibit was a huge painting in the Jesuitic European style of the 18th century, showing a long queue of European ambassadors waiting patiently to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor. And the explicit message of the exhibit was, yesterday you paid tribute to us. Tomorrow you will pay tribute to us again. And thanks to Trump, it's coming more rapidly than the Chinese thought it would. That's the first factor, which is huge. The second factor, I would describe it as an implosion of a region, and that's the Middle East. And the fact that it coincides with the first factor makes it very different. The implosion of the Middle East could be explained around three words. The first one is fragmentation. The boundaries of the Middle East have been largely defined by Europe a century ago. We were drawing what was called famously or infamously line in the sands. And today, the countries that came about no longer exist as united countries. This is the case of Syria. This is the case of Iraq. One part of Iraq, the Kurdish part, has had a referendum over their independence. Libya no longer exists as a united country. Yemen is in the midst of a terrible civil war, and with the total indifference of the world public opinion. And you have a radicalization beyond the fragmentation, which comes from the escalation of rivalries between Shia Islam, the minority, and Sunni Islam, the majority, which in fact covers the long-standing rivalry between Persia and the Arab world, i.e. the Arabs and the non-Arabs. I will come back to that because it's fundamental. And there is a third key word which is more ambivalent, more mysterious, but that is the word expansion. The Middle East is not only a region that can be defined in geographic terms. First, it goes now further north to include the Maghreb, and it goes further east to include countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan. And you see a surge of fundamentalist Islam in Asia with what's happening in Indonesia, in the Philippines, or in Malaysia. So you have an evolution within a religion that has consequences for the balance of the world. That is, of course, through terrorism. And you have two explanations for terrorism. The first one is that terrorism is the product of the radicalization of Islam. The second interpretation is that terrorism is spreading through the Islamization of radicals. It's a very different thing. Radicals, maverick, slightly deranged people in search of identity decide that in their urge to exist through killing, it's much more noble to use Islam. It has nothing to do with Islam, but they use it. And both interpretations coexist. In the Middle East, the radicalization of Islam is clear. In Europe, the Islamization of radicals makes more sense as an interpretation. But then you have the most important factor right now, which is the constitution of two alliances within the Middle East marching against each other. You have on the one hand Saudi Arabia allied with Egypt and more openly with Israel, and on the other hand Iran backed by Russia and more clearly today by Turkey. And those two forces are using Lebanon as their playground, so to speak. And this is a very dangerous thing, and my country has involved itself into trying to contain that crisis. What is interesting is that the old, unsolved, unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict has disappeared from the diplomatic agenda, but it's still there in emotional terms. And if there was something on the Mount in Jerusalem, it could reverberate in the Muslim world everywhere. But so it's an unresolved problem, and it's always dangerous to have unresolved problem, but it's not on top of the agenda. A tectonic shift in geopolitical terms, the implosion of an entire region. Well, it's too good an opportunity for my third factor, which is the return of Russia with a vengeance. The Russians have been humiliated by their defeat, the fall upon itself of the Soviet Union. And nature abhors emptiness. And the Russians under Putin have seen an opportunity for them to come back. And they did come back. They did come back through force in Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria. They played a decisive role in the maintenance of Bashar al-Assad regime in Damascus by deceit and strange ways in their attempt, sometimes successful, to influence, modify the results of elections in democratic countries. They intervene in the American elections. It's beyond doubt. They intervene in the Brexit referendum. They try to intervene in the French elections, but not very successfully. And they are using all the tools of propaganda that not only the Soviet Union, but the Tsarist regime used in the past to destabilize the West. And we have to fix limits to Moscow. And that is a third challenge, which is a very important one. We don't want to go to war with Russia. We want to understand what led to their humiliation. But we want to say to them, don't go too far. We will not accept it. The fourth factor, which is essential to understand the world, is the domestic evolution of the United States. What has happened to this country that made people dream? The Statue of Liberty, the land of all opportunities, the soft power of soft power, the Hollywood of whatever. And in order to understand what has happened in the United States, I think you have to go back to Brexit, because the very factors that led to the victory of the Brexiters in Great Britain led to the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And here again, I will use three key words. The first one is anger. Anger at the elite, political, economic, intellectual, from the people who feel they are not part of the elite. And one of the key reasons why this anger has exploded is the escalation of inequalities. Globalization worked, but globalization has increased the differences between the very rich and the poor. And you have statistics in the United States which are startling. In 1970, in an average American firm, the difference between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid one was between 40 to 1. In 2007, it was 400 to 1. In 2013, it was 600 to 1. It means that at that level, there's no longer a sense of belonging to the same country. You don't relate, you don't have the same needs, you don't live the same life. And because of globalization, the very poor know exactly how the very rich are living. We live in a transparent, interdependent world. And anger at the discrepancy of the system. The American philosopher from Japanese origin, Francis Fukuyama, spoke very eloquently of the victory of vetocracy over democracy, leading to the paralysis of the political system. That is what we saw in the United States. The second key word beyond anger is fear. I mean, America used to present itself as the land of all opportunities, as a bridge between culture. And suddenly the land of bridges wants to erect walls. There's a disconnect, it doesn't work. And in the case of the British, in the Brexit, they were afraid of the Eastern European. In the case of the Americans, they are afraid of the Hispanics. And in both cases, they were afraid of terrorism. And beyond these two words, there's a third one, which I would call nostalgia. Nostalgia for a world that no longer exists. In the case of the United States, it's nostalgia for the 1950s, for a white America, where black could not become president of the United States, where workers felt part of the middle class. And there is an element of revenge, rebellion, revolt of the small white people that elected Donald Trump in the United States of America. This is where we are now. And in the case of Great Britain, the issue of Brexit, the nostalgia was for the empire. I mean, I don't know whether you saw that television series, Downton Abbey, very popular all over the world. Well, there was the nostalgia of Downton Abbey, even if it never existed that way. There was a feeling, a time when Great Britain was ruling the wave. Rule Britannia, Britain never shall be slave. That's that element. And as a result of what happened, the Americans have elected as their president the least fitted person in the entire American history. And of course he's contained, he's surrounded by sometimes highly competent people. I met some of them. But still, the soft power of the United States, the power to convince, has been shattered by the election of Donald Trump. And there are fears that the hard power of the United States, the power to contain, to impose, may be badly used by America. In that context, well, there is one continent in which you're standing today that is at a turning point. Can we substitute for the United States when it comes to fighting climate change, when it comes to incarnating liberal democracy, human capitalism? Or are we too divided to do so? And in a way, in Europe today, you have two figures opposing each other. Macron in France and Orban in Hungary. They are the two sides of Europe. Which side will win? This is a decisive issue for us. And of course, I don't have the answer. Though for the first time in more than 20 years, I'm prudently optimistic about my country. For the first time, we have the right man in the right position at the right time. It's not enough to guarantee success, but it's enough to say that success is possible. There's a ray of hope. But the difficulties are there. You have, in fact, within Europe, clear divisions from an economic standpoint between Northern Europe that succeeds and Southern Europe that does much less well. The two opposing cases being Germany on the one hand and Greece on the other. Then you have an East-West division in terms of values, in terms of relation with the other. There is the Europe that keeps its boundaries open. like Germany again, and the Europe that closes its boundaries. And then you have a division between the European who want to progress further, who are saying, well, we cannot count on the United States any longer. Threats are coming closer to us through the south, with possible terrorist attempts, through the east, with Russia's ambition. We have to do more to become a hard power. And if we want to remain a model, we have to be an actor, because we can't be a model if we are no longer an actor. And it is a totally open question. There's a new balance within Europe between France and Germany. Yesterday, the Germans were terrorized by the fear that France would be led by Marine Le Pen and the National Front. Today, the French are wondering whether Germany will be daring enough to accept the end that Macron extends to the Germans. In fact, it's fascinating to see that Emmanuel Macron speaks to the Germans the way Helmut Kohl spoke to the French 20 and some years ago. He was saying, I remember seeing him, watching him doing that, I am your last chance. I'm deeply European because I went through the war. Don't waste that opportunity. The Germans will come after me, will not be as European as I am. And Macron says to the Germans, don't waste this opportunity. I mean, you have the most sincerely pro-European president in the history of the Fifth Republic since François Mitterrand. Don't waste that opportunity. And I'm hopeful that Angela Merkel will be responsible enough, strong enough to take that opportunity. What are the lessons we can derive from this overview of the world problems in at the end of 2017? Europe, I start with my continent, has to be much more modest and much more ambitious. In the past decades, we've been arrogant and lacking ambition. This is the gist of what I said before. But we all have to realize that the world we are coming in is deeply changed by the digital revolution, by the information revolution, by the multiplication of non-state actors like GAFA, who are changing the nature of the balance of power in the world. And how to adjust to a new environment while maintaining a sense of the old principles of diplomacy. That is the challenge for today. Firms, big firms, are geopolitical actors, the way they were not at that level before. They have a political responsibility. They have a social responsibility, even if one should not expect them to become Mother Teresa. They want to make profit, because by making profit, they create jobs, they keep the economy moving. But at the same time, they must be aware that they have other responsibilities which come with power. This is the key lesson. With power comes responsibility. This is a message for China. This is a message for GAFA. This is a message for all those who come with a certain sense of power. And there is, of course, a global responsibility for the survival of the planet, which we all have. I mean, the Chinese never had it so good and never had it so bad. Both. They never had it so good in terms of their financial capabilities. You see the rise of a middle class in China, which no one dreamed of 40 years ago, and accompanying that, a level of pollution that kills, according to statistics, more than 3 million Chinese per year. And so the Chinese contradiction is fascinating from that standpoint. The life expectancy of the Chinese have increased by 36 years between 1960 and 2010. It's incredible. But of course 1960 is a very bad year for China. There's the Cultural Revolution, there is all the madness of the end of the Mao Zedong regime. Nevertheless, it's striking. The Russians, for example, male Russian, have a life expectancy that has not really seriously increased, which is 24 years shorter than the Japanese men, for example. It's huge. If you're born in Japan, you can reach the age of 84 without much difficulties. If you are a man in Russia at 60, it's very iffy. And so you have that. How do we make sure that we restore a sense of balance within the world and a sense of responsibility for the world? This is what I mean trying to distinguish between the trend and the trendy.